It is a great pleasure to be with you. I'm sure it's as great a pleasure for me to speak for the last time as it is for you to hear me for the last time. But I want to speak, as you've heard, on... Well, first of all, I should give thanks to Ken and Ben for being such great hosts. I know Dr. Aiken is not here today, but it's been wonderful getting to know Professor Aiken, and thanks too to Emily Harrison, who helped set the whole thing up logistically. And so very grateful for the very kind welcome that my wife and I received here, and we leave with very happy memories. I want to speak today, the title, Condemned to be Free, of course, comes from a statement by Jean-Paul Sartre, talking about existentialism as a humanism. I begin my humanities classes at Grove City College with that statement because it strikes me as something that is intuitively incomprehensible to a lot of Americans, where freedom is seen as a good thing, by and large, in America. And I start my lectures in humanities by telling the students they're condemned to be free. They have no idea what I'm talking about. Then I tell them that they have to choose their own topic for the paper they're going to submit for my course, which will be decisive as to their final grade. And suddenly they begin to realize that actually freedom is not the unalloyed joy that it's often made out to be. Freedom can be a great burden. And what I want to talk about today, I want to give you part of something that I've been working on really since I published my larger book on the self. Numerous thoughts have been circulating, and one of the challenges I faced over the last couple of years is teaching humanities at Grove City College is how do I present the history of modernity to students in a way that will allow them to understand what's going on, but also allow me to present the Christian gospel to them in a way that makes sense given the way that they have been conditioned to think by modern culture. And I tend to play it in this way. I set up the story of modernity as wrestling with two fundamental but on the surface somewhat contradictory aspects of what it means to be human. As human beings, we intuitively know ourselves as free creatures. We get up in the morning, we make decisions. Some of them trivial, what do I have for breakfast? Some of them more substantial, whom do I marry? Where do I go to college? But we are conscious of being free in making those decisions. At the same time, we're also aware that freedom is not all that there is. And as I try to argue in my book on the self, freedom is not what, for example, the LGBTQ movement is primarily concerned with. There's also the issue of belonging. It's not enough to be free. We want to be recognized as the people we think we are by other people. That's what makes life worth living. And as I say to the students, those two things cannot be easily tied together, because to be free is one thing. To belong, that requires a sacrifice of our freedom. The radically free individual is in some ways the egregious, misanthropic individual. To be a true human being, we want to tie those two things together, freedom and belonging. I don't have time to do it today, and it will be, we would say in the UK, it'll be like carrying coals to Newcastle to bring it round to the gospel and try to present the gospel as answering that problem. But I want to set that up today because what I want to look at is one half of that. And I want to say that one of the problems with human beings today is we still want to belong. But the old and established ways of belonging have been plunged, crisis is an overused word, but I'm going to overuse it once more, have been plunged into a kind of crisis that helps us explain many of the dramatic tensions we feel in our own individual lives, and which we often see being played out in rather dramatic and sometimes violent ways in the public square on the streets of Western countries, of which America, of course, is no exception. So I want to start by talking about communities. Communities, the places where we belong, are not what they used to be. In an influential book, Imagine Communities, the political scientist and historian Benedict Anderson argued that the idea of the nation state involved what he called an imagined community. And as Anderson happens to be a Marxist, but he's one of the more useful Marxists out there. As Anderson explores the issue of a nation, he makes a number of observations. A nation, almost by definition, involves an area so vast in terms of geographical space, such large populations. I do hate these Britney Spears kind of microphones. You will see me being irritated by it repeatedly during the talk. Nations, almost by definition, involve so vast an area of geographical space, such large populations, and so many individual communities, villages, towns, cities, that it is impossible for everybody to know everybody else. This means that for a nation to exist, its members must imagine that they hold things in common that give them a coherent identity as a body of people. Forgive the English geography here, I will use some American geography at points, but the hairdresser in Cornwall, in the southwest of England, must identify in some way with the docker in Tyneside, in the northeast, for the concept of England to have any real authority. In American terms, we might say the trucker in Seattle must identify at some deep level with the restaurant owner in Florida if the idea of America is to make any sense. And what binds them together, what provides this common sense of identity, is in part a strong national narrative, something that gives each of them a sense of history, a sense of belonging, we might almost say in a good sense, a sense of pride. In short, a sense of identity. In Britain, there were patriotic songs that spoke to this. Land of hope and glory for the English, Scotland the brave for the Scots, land of my fathers for the Welsh. The American national anthem and the calendar marking those dates in the nation's history that define its identity. Thanksgiving, July the 4th, Veterans Day, Martin Luther King Jr. Day, all serve to press the power of the national narrative onto the population. I say to the students, think of how you measure time. Americans measure time relative to the national story. Oh, that happened around about July the 4th, or it happened just after Thanksgiving. The way we mark time in America reinforces that sense of national identity. And these national narratives provide the basis for patriotism. The commitment to a national cause, which motivated men to sign up, for example, for the army in the First and Second World Wars. The identity of the individual men who signed up was so wrapped up with the nation that a strike against their country was a strike, in a sense, against them. To risk death for that country was a comprehensible act, because the threat to the nation was a threat to each and every one of them and their families. My wife and I, when we were students in Aberdeen, we knew a couple, the Wills. And Sam Will, the husband, who's actually a Baptist, he and his wife got married in August 1939. And I think in October 1939, he signed up to join the army, and he went overseas. And he didn't see his wife for 6 years. I have to get my head around that. You marry a girl and you go away for war for 6 years and you come back as an utterly different human being than the one you left. And yet, of course, in his mind, the needs of the nation far outweighed the needs of him as an individual. We might say of these soldiers, for example, that even though few of them actually knew each other in their real daily lives, they still saw themselves as all belonging to a community whose cause they saw as greater than themselves. And that, we might note, is true belonging. And it's rooted in the imagination. That does not mean the sense of belonging is imaginary, in the sense of not being true or not really existing, but it does mean that it is rooted in a way of thinking and not in the fact of personal acquaintance with every other member of the community. And this is where our current situation becomes rather complicated. What happens when the narratives that provide us with our traditional identities lose their authority and become highly contested? When the ways in which we belong start to fall apart? If the perennial need to belong persists, where do human beings find that belonging in a world where the traditional forms of such belonging, family, church, nation, are no longer plausible, or to use our Anderson's terminology, where traditional communities can no longer be imagined as they once were. To answer this, it is useful, as I noted last night, to note that technology plays a key role. If technology in the form of the pill helped to undermine traditional sexual codes, then in the form of the internet, it helps to weaken the traditional narratives of our imagined communities and offers others to replace them. Indeed, information technology now means that there is a multitude of competing narratives and consequently many different ways of imagining communities. If the imagined community of the nation depended upon an agreed national story and means by which that national story could be promoted and maintained, then that assumed that there were coherent means of telling that story. In short, a unified community assumed certain limitation to information that allowed for a single dominant narrative or collection of narratives to give coherence to the whole. Now, that is not to argue that censorship of information, such as we now see in China, is a good thing. That too has a distorting impact on a people's sense of identity. It's simply to note that the explosion of information facilitated by technology is having a profound effect on how we in the West think of ourselves. For example, when I was a child in Britain, there were only 3 television channels. That meant that the national news was presented by a tiny handful of programs. New movies had to be watched at the cinema because it was years before they would be licensed for the television. There were perhaps less than 10 national newspapers, of which only about half offered serious news analysis. Knowledge of the rest of the world was mediated by newsprint, photographs, and the very occasional piece of video footage. Even America seemed a long way away. I was laughing this morning how students at Grove find it hard to believe that when I was growing up, the three most famous cities in America were New York, Los Angeles, and Milwaukee. And people say, well, how did Milwaukee make the cut? Happy Days. It was the first American series that really sort of gripped the mind of British youth. I grew up with the Fonz and Richie, etc. So I thought Milwaukee was a great American city, and I come over here and, it's, you go there to change planes to go somewhere else. That's the kind of, apologies to any Milwaukee natives that may be here. In short, the national narrative was strong because the dominant media voices were few, and while not all in total agreement, operated within fairly narrow narrative boundaries. The alternatives were weak or non-existent, yes. The Morning Star, the Socialist Workers' Revolutionary Party newspaper, offered a Marxist commentary on Britain in the 70s, but it was read by almost nobody, and it carried no serious weight at mainstream institutions. It was certainly very hard to be in an imagined community with people on the other side of the world. This was one reason why, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Marxist revolutionaries were constantly frustrated that class identity proved weaker than national, religious, and familial identities. There was no real means by which to create an imagined community that united workers across the globe with stronger ties than the dominant national narratives. I think it's one of the reasons why the German Revolution fails, 1918, 1919. There is no class consciousness of a kind required by Marxist theory for a proper revolution. Today, all that has changed. National narratives are not the means for social unity, but have instead become battle zones. And it's very hard to be part of an imagined community when the nature of what is to be imagined is itself a primary source of division. But not only are the narratives of nations being contested, they're facing challenges from other narratives and other ways of being imagined communities. A moment's reflection indicates this. The language of community is now routinely applied to categories that have little or nothing to do with nation, religion, or family. There is the Black community, the LGBTQ+ community, the Asian community, the disabled community. I guess I belong to the expat British community, even the BDSM community. The use of the word community for these various groups indicates both the collapse of traditional notions of belonging and the rise of a vast and growing number of alternative ways of human beings imagining their relationship to those around them. When identity is grounded in psychology and the internet allows for the indulgence of any and all means of thinking about that identity, the concept of community starts to lack any real solidity. People can now pick and choose their communities. That means they can pick and choose their identities. One intriguing and instructive example, and this fascinates me. I said yesterday at the library talk, I almost used this sentence rather than "I'm a woman trapped in a man's body" as the sort of the entry point into my book. But I thought the sexual revolution probably caught the popular imagination more. But one intriguing and instructive example is that provided by the emergence of Islamic State, or ISIS. At numerous points during the years when it dominated news headlines in the West, I frequently heard some version of the following phrase used with regard to young, affluent Westerners who had chosen to identify with its cause. The phrase is this: he pledged allegiance to ISIS online. There are many interesting aspects to such a statement. What does it mean to pledge allegiance online? How has the online world come to hold such a grip on imaginations that such an act makes sense to some individuals? These questions rest upon the most obvious fact that the statement reveals. The various individuals who did this clearly imagined that the ISIS community, even when exclusively mediated to them via its online presence on websites and blogs, was a more powerful source of belonging and identity than their families or the nations to which their passports indicated they belonged. Only in a world where the old forms of belonging have been dramatically weakened and new forms of community have gained imaginative traction, can pledging allegiance online to ISIS come to make any sense? The role of media and information technology in this has an importance that can scarcely be exaggerated. Geography is far less significant now than under the old imagined community of the nation state. Now, as Anderson's notion of imagined community makes clear, geography was not itself the central factor, even in the old nation state, because nations presupposed a sense of common identity that was not built on personal proximity or acquaintance. Given the fact that nations have borders, it was necessary that, for example, Americans in Texas live closer to Mexico than to Maine, and yet still feel greater affinity for and identity with the inhabitants of Portland than those of Guadalajara. Well, I'm not sure about it. Maybe Texas is not a good example to use there. I remember years ago, I found myself in Billy Bob's in Fort Worth, and Willie Nelson did an impromptu concert. And I remember him playing in front of a giant American flag, about half the set. And then halfway through the set, suddenly the Texas flag dropped down in front of the American flag and everybody went absolutely berserk. And I thought, yeah, Texas is bigger than America in the eyes of Texans. But I grew up 40 miles from Wales and hundreds of miles from Newcastle. But like the natives of Newcastle, I consider myself English and not Welsh. Yet geography was still somewhat significant as locating key institutions, defining national territory, and providing a physical context for the national narrative. None of that applies in the age of the internet. Indeed, time and space are both transformed by the internet. The web can provide an immediacy of both, which was unknown to earlier generations because it was simply impossible. As it does so, it then enables, even encourages people to reimagine the communities to which they belong. As the worldwide protests of the summer of 2020 indicate, a police action in the United States can seem more real and immediate to people around the world than events in their neighboring towns. When British people were marching to protest the death of George Floyd, I mentioned this last night, I was struck by the lack of similar protests in Britain concerning the ongoing struggle for human rights in Hong Kong. And yet Hong Kong has a much closer historical connection to the British national narrative than does Minneapolis. And while it may be further away in the age of jet air travel, that is not really a significant factor. a matter of just a few hours. Even so, it was fascinating that events in the Midwestern American city seemed far more immediate and real to many British people, far more relevant to the emerging imagined community than events in a place that was a British colony until as recently as 1997. The national narrative was disappearing, and a new narrative, that of social justice, was emerging to take its place. Furthermore, it's not simply the immediacy of the internet, but also the sheer volume and variety of information it offers that has transformed how we think about the world. The 3 TV channels of my youth have been replaced with hundreds of the same. Websites offer a seemingly infinite amount of information, readily available at the click of a mouse. The ability for a single narrative, or a small handful of narratives, to dominate the airwaves is long past. In this sense, we might argue that there is one unifying narrative that lies behind the diversity of competing narratives on offer. It is that of the power of the individual to choose his or her identity. No longer are we presented with powerful, fixed narratives, such as that of nation, family, or even bodily sex. Now we are free to choose the narrative to which we wish to belong, the imagined community that will provide us with our identity and our purpose. We can focus on those narratives that make us feel good and that confirm our chosen view of the world, and ignore those that present challenges to this. If the Reformation made religion a choice and represented a key move in placing the individual at the center of things, the internet has extrapolated that to vast swathes of life. We can now choose our narratives and our communities more easily than previous generations chose shoes and clothes. When we connect this to what I said earlier about the need for recognition, the current conflicts that are causing such tensions within the Western world start to make sense. Our societies are formally organized along the lines of the old community of the nation state. We have institutions and calendars that reflect the imagined community of the nation. We still grant 1 vote to each person in California and 1 to each person in Arkansas, on the grounds that we share a common cause, that of the United States of America as a nation. Yet so many members of that society made up of American citizens now find that the narratives which most strongly shape their identities are not those of the nation state, but rather those of race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality. They can chat to friends across the globe online. They can see political events unfolding in real time as they happen in far-off countries and feel a natural human empathy for the people they immediately affect. They can feel affinity for those who share the same skin color, sexual orientation, language in other countries, an affinity they may no longer feel for the neighbor living next door with whom they do not share such things. That's a situation in which conflict is bound to occur. And I think it explains why many of the narratives today despise traditional institutions. They see them as problematic because they are constructed around a different understanding of identity. And it also explains why time, should we celebrate Columbus Day or Juneteenth, and space, which names are appropriate for buildings, whose statues should be allowed to stand where, are both arenas of this conflict. And as I constantly say to students at Grove, these are not trivial debates. It doesn't matter where you come down on those discussions. The marking of time and the marking of space is very important for understanding who we are. And these cannot be dismissed as snowflake or politically correct discussions. They're vitally important to how we think of ourselves. The conquest of time and space by new narratives is critical to those narratives gaining hold of the popular imagination. In the past, civil society was possible because whatever the differences that existed between citizens, there was a deeper narrative, a deeper sense of identity and community that all shared and that served to relativize such. Therefore, when an election was won by one party, adherents of the other party respected the result because something deeper than party politics, the nation itself, was strong enough to provide a sense of underlying unity. As the elections of Donald Trump in 2016 and Joe Biden in 2020 have demonstrated, that's no longer the case. Modern American society is fragmented because the imagined communities to which people choose to belong lack any shared narrative. Therefore, the terms of recognition that one group wishes to see American society adopt are often antithetical to those of the others. And this leads to further conflict because the very existence of alternative narratives can be seen as a threat to a given community's identity. Conclusion. All of this points to the fact that we now live at a time when the very issue of identity is an unstable, volatile, highly contentious, and even unprecedented matter. Now, it is not unusual for commentators on contemporary events, whether professional critics or amateur pundits, to make hyperbolic claims about crises and living in unprecedented times. That is usually the moment at which the trained but annoying historian steps forward with a condescending smile and declares that no, actually there is a precedent. Maybe 14th century Florence or 16th century Spain or Germany between the wars, and that yes, we have seen all this before. And there is often truth to such responses, as we all have a tendency to think of our own era and our own problems as unprecedented and uniquely challenging. We need to be reminded that this is not typically the case. I would, however, argue that the coincidence of two things makes our current moment in time a singularly challenging and potentially sinister one. And these two things are the plastic conception of human identity, to which our emphasis on individualism tilts, and the liquefaction of the world around us with regard to the traditional frameworks by which human beings have previously defined themselves. That places us in a situation without obvious historical parallel. In the past, at least the past of the last few hundred years, in the West, there has been sufficient cultural and institutional continuity over time to offer some stable framework for each person to find their identity in something that offered stability. Again, to repeat my mantra, nation, church, and family were perhaps the three most obvious. But even as these three became increasingly tenuous in the late 20th century, our bodies still offered some minimal level of continuity and stability. The person born with a male body did not have to decide his gender. It was a given, over which he had no authority. The mother who gave birth to a daughter did not wake up 20 years later to find that her daughter no longer existed, but was now a son. And I'm sure that, just as an aside on the gender dysphoria issue, I'm sure that there are those who struggle with genuine gender dysphoria. More common, though, I think, is a kind of crisis of belonging. I was talking to a young man, contacted me recently and said, "Can we talk?" And I said, "Sure." I said, "What's the problem?" And he said, "My problem is that I think I'm a woman trapped in a man's body." And I said, "Well, tell me about it. Okay, explain why do you feel that way?" And so he told me his life story, and it was a kind of heartbreaking life story in some ways. He said, "I was at school and I was a bit of a geek." He said, I forgot what game he played. He was heavily into some game that he played. He said, and the other guys at school, they despised me and they bullied me and they treated me like garbage. And the girls were kind to me. And I said, "Let me guess. You really wanted to belong to the girls, didn't you? Because that was the community where you felt you should belong and they were kind to you." And he said, "That's it exactly." And I said to him, "Your problem is not that you were born in the wrong body. Your problem is that you have a natural desire to belong. And the only people who are kind to you are the girls in your classroom." Today, the self is entirely plastic, and the external world, right down to our bodies, is liquid, something which offers no firm ground upon which to build an identity. That no doubt helps to explain, for example, the catastrophic levels of depression and anxiety in the West, which on the whole enjoys greater material prosperity and security than has been typical throughout human history. 40% of college kids in the United States now have some connection with college counseling centers for depression or anxiety in themselves or a close friend while they're at college. And it doesn't matter whether you go to a Christian college or a secular college, the statistics are about the same. That's staggering. My dad's earliest memories were being carried down to the bomb shelter at the end of the garden because the Luftwaffe were trying to kill him on a nightly basis. And yet my dad never felt the anxiety that many of the kids in my classes at Grove now feel routinely. That's an interesting phenomenon, isn't it? It's one that should break our hearts, I think. We are wealthier and healthier than our ancestors in the 16th and even the mid-20th centuries. But we do not know who we are anymore. As terrifying as that is to contemplate, it seems undeniable. Jean-Paul Sartre's comment that man is condemned to be free seems to capture something of our moment in time, for freedom without belonging is an unbearable burden. It also helps to explain the power of newly emerging identities, such as those offered by the LGBTQ+ movement. What I want to do just in the dying moments here is to make a plea for not approving of these communities, but at least taking them seriously in terms of the challenge they present. Often in conservative Christian circles, our immediate response is they're wrong. And I'll say, yeah, they're wrong, but maybe it's the wrong answer to a legitimate question that's being asked. And it's not enough simply to tell people they're wrong. You've got to provide them with the correct answer. In a world where old identities are implausible and where people still wish to belong, the most powerful narratives and the strongest communities offer a sense of belonging and security that all human beings crave. As we noted at the start, the dominant narratives pushed by the cultural elites now press us to think of terms of expressive individualism and sexual identity. They encourage us to see sexual fulfillment as a core component of a happy and fulfilled life. They shape our sentiments to see victimhood and marginalization, not simply as evils to be overcome, but also as granting the victimized and the marginal a moral status that makes their various causes something that is nearly impossible to oppose. But human selves exist in dialogue with the terms of recognition, these terms of recognition set by the wider world. And when that world is liquid, those terms are set by the loudest voices and the most dominant narratives. In our world, that is no longer in general the family, the church, or the nation. Yet our children still need to belong, to find identities. The challenge for us is to set forth narratives that give them such, and do so in a way that is good, beautiful, and above all true. That is the task that lies before us. It is daunting, but we must not forget that we are not alone. The church is the creation of God, and so the solution is one for which we need to take responsible action, but whose success is already guaranteed by God Himself. Short, what I'm saying there is, I think the church, thinking of itself as community, is part of the solution. We sadly waste our moment in time if all we do is worry about being marginalized and fall out with each other about the reasons for that marginalization. One of the things I learned as a historian, looking at the Reformation and beyond, is how marginal communities become powerful communities. My wife and I have a little taste of this, I guess, as immigrants. When my son got married in the summer, it suddenly came home to us that me, my wife, and my two sons, that's all we have over here. And with COVID, we can't even get our family over here. And I suddenly realized, as an immigrant, you become rather self-sufficient because you have to depend on the only people that you know well enough to depend upon. And if you look at history, marginal communities tend to become strong communities. The Jews in medieval Europe, there was a reason why they emerged as a strong, powerful cultural force. They were marginal. If you look at the history of the English Industrial Revolution, the great names of the Industrial Revolution are the names of the nonconformists, particularly the Quakers. Why? Well, because Quakers couldn't vote, nonconformists, Baptists, Presbyterians, Unitarians, Quakers. We couldn't vote. We couldn't go to university. We couldn't hold civil service positions. We couldn't be members of parliament. We couldn't teach. So what did we do? We made stuff. We made stuff. And we were a powerful community. And I think one of the things that we can learn from the LGBTQ movement today is, why have they become such a potent political force? Because they're a marginal community. They were all that they had. And that's not to approve the LGBTQ plus community at all, but is to say it's a fascinating success story. And I want to suggest that this is the moment for the church to rethink itself as a community where people can belong, because that will be powerful. I don't expect any major turnaround in American or Western society in my lifetime. I'm in my mid-50s now. I'm almost hoping to die so that I don't see it get much worse. But I think if what things we do now in terms of building community could well bear fruit 100, 150 years from now. I have a number of indulgences in life. I like fountain pens. I like shoes. I would like watches, but I don't have money to indulge in that. But if I ever had limitless money, I would buy a Patek Philippe watch. I remember my wife once saying to me, "What would you like for Christmas?" And I said, "Well, I've seen these adverts for these Patek Philippe watches. They look rather nice." She said, "How much are they?" I looked them up online. Entry-level Patek Philippe, $80,000. I bought houses for less than $80,000 in my time. I'm not buying a watch for that. But Patek Philippe watches have a great, if somewhat cheesy, byline. Their byline used to be, I don't know if it still is, was you never own a Patek Philippe. You merely look after it for the next generation. And I think that's a great byword or motto for the church relative to the gospel. What we're engaged in now is not for us. It's for future generations. I've outlined the problem today. The world is collapsing. Identities are fragmenting. Yet people still want to belong. Now is the moment when the church can step into that and provide a framework for belonging. That doesn't convert people. I know conversion is a spiritual thing, but it can certainly make the church potently attractive so that people will come through our doors and come under the sound of the gospel. Thanks for listening.